Welcome to Simply English.
English Learning Podcast episode, and we're really going to zero in on this problem of understanding versus speaking.
Right.
And pull out all those golden nuggets of advice to help you level up your spoken English.
Yeah, and it's not just theory. The episode is packed with real stories from people who've actually overcome this challenge.
That's awesome.
So we'll be sharing some of those inspiring examples too.
I love that. Okay, so first things first, the podcast really tackles the why behind this understanding speaking gap. It's not just about knowing the words, right?
Right. It's like, think of it this way. Understanding is like taking in information. It's passive,
Okay.
but speaking is active. It's real-time sentence construction, vocabulary recall, navigating grammar.
Oh, yeah.
It's like the difference between reading about exercise and actually hitting the gym.
I love that analogy. And honestly, I've definitely fallen into that trap of if I just listen to enough podcasts, the speaking will magically happen.
Yeah.
Not true.
And the podcast points out that a lot of learners overemphasize input reading, listening, at the expense of output, which is the actual speaking.
Yeah,
So it's a common pitfall.
it is. So how do we kind of shift gears and make speaking a more central part of our learning? The podcast broke down a bunch of techniques, but one that really stood out to me was shadowing.
Yeah.
And I've heard of this, but to be honest, I never really understood how it worked.
It's surprisingly simple, yet very effective. So imagine picking your favorite English speaker. It could be somebody from a movie, a podcast, whoever you enjoy listening to, and mimicking them almost like you're becoming their vocal twin.
Wow.
You're copying their pronunciation, their rhythm, their intonation.
So it's not just about repeating the words, it's really capturing the music of their speech.
Exactly. And the podcast explains how this actually helps build fluency. Because when you shatter it, you're training your mouth muscles to form those sounds naturally.
Right.
You're internalizing that natural rhythm and flow of English, which makes you sound more confident and less robotic.
It makes total sense. And they gave an example in the podcast too, right? Maya, who shadowed Emma Watson in interviews.
Yes. Maya chose Emma Watson because she admired her clear and engaging speaking style, and after a few months of consistent shadowing, her pronunciation and fluency improved dramatically.
Wow.
People even started commenting on how natural she sounded.
That's so cool. Okay, I'm intrigued. I might have to dust off my Harry Potter audiobooks and give this a try. It's like having a personal pronunciation coach, just available to you all the time.
Precisely.
What?
And you can tailor it to your interests. Whether you're into movies, podcasts, even stand-up comedy, there's someone out there whose speaking style you can learn from.
Awesome. Okay, shadowing is officially going on my to-do list. What else did the podcast recommend for kind of breaking through this speaking barrier?
Another powerful technique they highlighted is thinking in English.
Ooh.
And this one, I think, is truly foundational.
You know, I have to admit, just the phrase itself, thinking in English, it's a bit intimidating. It sounds like I need to become fluent overnight and just suddenly all my thoughts are in English.
It's not quite that drastic,
Yeah.
but it is about shifting your internal monologue.
Okay.
Because a lot of learners get stuck in what's called the translation loop. They'll hear something in English translated to their native language, formulate a response in their native language, and then translate it back to English.
Oh, wow, I do that all the time. No wonder I feel so slow and awkward when I'm trying to speak.
It's exhausting. Yeah. And it introduces that delay that makes conversations feel unnatural. So thinking in English is about short-circuiting that loop.
Got it. So how do we actually do that? Because they mentioned in the podcast Carlos, who would narrate his morning routine.
Exactly. Carlos started by describing very simple everyday activities in English. Things like, I'm making coffee, I'm getting dressed.
Okay.
And it sounds basic, but that constant narration helped his brain start forming those thoughts directly in English without that translation step.
Interesting. So basically, by constantly using simple English to describe what's happening, we can kind of rewire our brains.
It's like you're creating a new mental pathway. And the more you use it, the stronger it gets. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated. Even just 5 minutes a day of narrating your thoughts can have a significant impact over time.
I'm starting to see how this could be really powerful. By breaking free from that translation loop, conversations can become much more natural and spontaneous.
Exactly. And it makes everything else like your grammar, your vocabulary, much easier to access.
Yeah.
Because you're not constantly having to filter it through another language.
Okay, so we've got shadowing to train our pronunciation and fluency, and thinking in English to rewire our brains for more natural conversation. What other techniques did the podcast highlight?
Well, there's one that might seem a bit old school, but it's incredibly valuable. Reading aloud.
Oh, Okay, that takes me back to elementary school.
Yeah.
We used to do that all the time. Is it really that helpful for adults who are trying to improve their speaking?
It is. And the podcast backs this up with a great example. They talk about Sophia, who is an Italian student who was determined to improve her spoken English. She decided to read Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone out loud every night before bed.
Wow, an entire book out loud. That's dedication.
It was, and it paid off.
Hmm.
Not only did her pronunciation improve dramatically, but she also started speaking more fluently and confidently in her classes.
Okay, so how does reading aloud actually translate to better spoken English?
Well, think about it. When you're reading aloud, you're forcing yourself to articulate clearly.
Mm-hmm.
You're practicing your pronunciation, your intonation, your pacing, plus you're internalizing natural sentence structures,
Yeah.
which helps you speak more grammatically correct English without even having to think about the rules.
It's like a sneaky way to absorb all those grammar rules without actually studying them.
Exactly. It's a much more organic way to learn.
Yeah.
And of course, you can choose material that actually interests you.
Yeah.
Novels, news articles, even song lyrics.
Totally. Okay, reading aloud is officially back on my radar. Do you have any specific suggestions for me based on kind of what you know about me so far?
Well, given your interest in current events, I would recommend trying something like The Guardian or The New York Times.
Okay.
Their writing style is generally very clear and engaging, and it'll expose you to a wide range of vocabulary.
Perfect. Now, this next technique is one I've heard about, but always kind of dreaded, recording yourself speaking English.
I understand the hesitation.
Mm.
It can feel a little awkward at first,
Right.
but trust me, it's a game changer for identifying areas that you can improve. And the podcast even had a funny name for it. They called it Cringe and Learn.
Cringe and learn. I can definitely relate to that. But what makes it so valuable?
It's all about self-awareness because we don't often hear ourselves objectively when we speak.
Right.
So recording yourself allows you to step back and analyze your pronunciation, your pace, your grammar, really everything.
They shared the story of Amir in the podcast, right? Who realized that he was speaking too fast and actually skipping words.
Yeah.
Is that a common problem?
It is, especially when we're nervous or excited.
Yeah.
And Amir actually used those recordings to slow down, practice enunciating more clearly, and ultimately he became a much more confident and understandable speaker.
Okay, you've conversed me, but where do I even start? Should I record myself giving like a presentation?
No.
That feels way too intense.
Start small. The podcast suggested something as simple as a 1-minute elevator pitch about yourself. Just a quick summary of who you are, what you do, maybe a few of your interests.
Okay, a 1-minute elevator pitch. I can do that. I can even practice that in the mirror first. What other kind of actionable tips did the podcast offer?
Well, they strongly emphasized that nothing beats actual conversation practice. All this practice is great, but at the end of the day, speaking is about connecting with other human beings.
Makes sense. But finding opportunities to actually practice can be tough, especially if you're not living in an English-speaking country. What did the podcast suggest?
They had a few great ideas. So first language exchange apps. Have you ever tried any of those?
I've heard of them, but I haven't taken the plunge yet. What are they exactly?
So basically, they connect you with people all over the world who are learning your native language.
Okay.
And you help each other out.
Cool.
You can text, voice call, even video chat, all while practicing your target language.
That sounds fun. And like a great way to meet people, too. Did they mention any specific apps?
Yes. They recommended Tandem and HelloTalk as two popular options. They both have large user bases and offer features like text correction and voice notes, which can be really helpful.
Awesome. Okay, I'll definitely check those out. What other options are there for like real-life conversation practice?
Well, they also mentioned local meetups or online communities.
Yeah.
So depending on where you live, there might be groups specifically for English language learners who meet up regularly to practice and socialize.
Right, and if there's not a local group, you can always find an online community.
Exactly.
It's all about finding that like supportive environment to practice without feeling judged, right?
Exactly. The podcast even shared a story about Jackie, who was initially very shy about speaking English in public. But she started attending a local meetup and eventually gained enough confidence to actually lead group discussions.
Wow, that's amazing. Proof that pushing yourself outside that comfort zone can lead to some pretty incredible growth.
Absolutely. And, we can tailor this advice to your specific needs and preferences. Are you more comfortable with in-person interaction or online communities? Let's figure out what would be the best fit.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we've got language exchange apps, meetups, online communities, All great options for getting that real-world conversation practice. What else?
Okay, so they introduced this technique that might surprise you, the question and answer method.
The question and answer method, what is that?
So it's like talking to yourself,
Okay.
but it's more about training yourself to think and speak in English spontaneously.
Right.
So the idea is to come up with a question, it could be any question, and then answer it out loud as if you were talking to someone else.
I can see how that could be useful. Like you could do it anywhere, right?
Exactly.
Okay. On the go.
They mentioned Priya in the podcast, who used this method to prepare for a job interview.
Oh, wow.
So she'd write down common interview questions and then practice answering them out loud, really working on both her content and her delivery.
And it worked.
She aced the interview.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And the podcast suggests starting with simple questions like, what did you do today? Or what are your plans for the weekend?
Yeah, okay. I can definitely see myself incorporating that into my daily routine.
Yeah,
It's like giving myself little speaking quizzes throughout the day.
exactly. And it helps you become more comfortable with formulating thoughts directly in English, which is crucial for fluency.
All right, so we've covered shadowing thinking in English, reading aloud, recording yourself, finding conversation partners, and this question and answer method. Anything else from this treasure trove of advice?
One more key technique, and it's one you've probably heard before, immersion.
Immersion. Okay, the classic, surround yourself with English advice.
Yeah.
But honestly, I'm always a little lost on how to do that effectively.
Okay.
It feels like more than just watching Netflix with English subtitles, right?
It's about actively engaging with the language, not just passively absorbing it. The podcast gave a great example of Lena, who became obsessed with rewatching the sitcom Friends.
Class.
But she didn't just watch it, she used it as a learning tool.
Okay.
So she'd pause the show,
Right.
mimic the dialogue, repeat the lines, really try to capture that natural rhythm and intonation of the characters.
So smart. It turns a show you already enjoy into a language learning opportunity.
Exactly. And the podcast highlighted that you can apply this to any English language media that you enjoy. So what are some of your favorites?
Well, I'm a big fan of documentaries.
Okay.
Especially nature documentaries.
Nice.
Like with David Attenborough narrating, I find his voice so soothing.
That's a fantastic choice.
Yeah.
His narration is very clear, it's engaging, and it's full of interesting vocabulary.
It is.
You could try watching with subtitles on and off, and then maybe even try mimicking his narration style yourself.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah,
It's all about finding ways to make immersion both enjoyable and educational.
precisely.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be limited to TV and movies.
Yeah.
You can listen to English podcasts, you can read English books, even change the language settings on your phone and computer.
Switching my phone to English. That's a bold move, but I could see how it would force me to think and interact in English more often.
Exactly. It's about making English a constant presence in your life, not just something you study for a few hours a week.
Totally. Okay. Immersion is officially getting an upgrade in my learning routine. What else did this jam-packed podcast cover?
There's one more crucial message that I think we all need to hear. Embrace your mistakes.
Easier said than done, right? I think most of us have that, like, fear of sounding silly or making grammatical errors.
And the podcast argues that that fear is actually one of the biggest obstacles to fluency.
Really?
Yeah, they share the story of David, who was an engineer who used to be terrified of speaking up in meetings because he was so afraid of making mistakes.
I've been there. It's like that fear just paralyzes you.
And he decided to shift his mindset.
Okay.
So instead of seeing mistakes as failures, he started viewing them as opportunities to learn and grow.
Did that really work? Did his colleagues judge him for making mistakes?
The opposite happened.
Well-
His colleagues really appreciated his willingness to communicate, even if his English wasn't perfect. They valued his ideas, and they were happy to help him improve his language skills.
That's really encouraging. It reminds me that fluency is really about connection and communication. It's not about being perfect.
Exactly. And the podcast even shared a quote from Winston Churchill that really resonated with me. He said, "Success is not, final failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts."
That's powerful. It's a reminder that learning a language is a journey, and mistakes are just part of the process.
And the more comfortable we are with making mistakes, the faster we'll learn and grow. So give yourself permission to stumble, to laugh at yourself, and to keep practicing.
Embracing mistakes is officially my new mantra. What else did the podcast cover?
Let's talk vocabulary.
Okay.
It might seem obvious, but having a rich vocabulary is absolutely essential for expressing yourself clearly and confidently.
I can relate to that. Sometimes I feel like I have the thoughts, but I just don't have the words to express them in English.
Yeah, and the podcast highlighted how a limited vocabulary can be a major roadblock. They shared the story of Hiroshi, who developed a really effective system for learning new words.
Okay, tell me about Hiroshi's method.
So he would read English news articles and highlight any unfamiliar words.
Okay.
Then he'd look them up, write them down in a notebook, and try to use them in conversations as soon as possible.
So it's not just passively encountering new words, it's actively seeking them out and then putting them to use?
Exactly. It's about turning vocabulary learning into a habit.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be limited to news articles. You could do this with books, movies, podcasts, anything you enjoy.
I like that. Okay, Hiroshi's method's going in my toolkit.
Yeah.
Now, the podcast also touched on pronunciation, which I know is a big one for a lot of learners.
Yeah, they emphasize that clear pronunciation is crucial for feeling confident and making sure people can understand you easily.
Yeah,
It's like the polish that makes your spoken English shine.
makes sense. I know I've struggled to understand people with strong accents or unclear pronunciation before.
It can be a real communication barrier. And the podcast shared the story of Maria, who had difficulty with the R sound in English, which is a common challenge for speakers of certain languages.
Yeah, rolling your R's can definitely be tricky.
She practiced diligently with tongue twisters.
Oh, yeah.
Remember those?
Red lorry, yellow lorry. I can feel my tongue getting tied just thinking about it.
They can be a bit silly, but they are incredibly effective for training those mouth muscles and improving pronunciation.
Right. And they mentioned apps too, right?
Yes, they recommended pronunciation apps like Elsa Speak or Forvo.
Okay.
Elsa Speak is great for personalized feedback on your pronunciation, while Forvo lets you hear how native speakers pronounce different words and phrases.
Cool. Those sound like valuable tools. Are there any specific pronunciation tips or resources that you think I should look into, given what you know about my language background?
Absolutely. But I think we've covered a lot of ground already in this part of our deep dive. Maybe we can save that discussion for the next part after a quick recap of what we've learned so far.
That sounds good to me. This has been a lot to process, but in the best way possible. I feel like we've gone beyond just listing techniques and really started to understand why they work and how to actually make them a part of my everyday life.
That's fantastic to hear.
Yeah.
And remember, you're not alone on this journey. Countless people have faced these same challenges and come out the other side as confident, fluent English speakers.
That's encouraging. Okay, so before we move on, let's take a moment to recap some of the key takeaways from this part of our deep dive. What stood out to you the most?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that we need to be more active in our approach to learning spoken English. You know, it's not enough to just passively consume content.
Right.
We have to actually use the language to make mistakes and learn from them.
Totally. And I love how the podcast emphasized that practice makes progress, not perfection. And they offered so many practical techniques for making that practice more effective and engaging.
Exactly. And what's great is that we can tailor those techniques to fit our individual needs and preferences.
For sure. Speaking of tailoring, one of the techniques that really stuck with me was that thinking in English idea. It feels like such a game changer, but also a bit daunting.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on how to actually make that shift?
It's definitely a skill that takes time and practice,
Right.
but even small steps can make a big difference.
Right.
So remember Carlos, who narrated his morning routine?
Yeah.
You don't have to start by narrating your entire day.
Okay.
Begin with what I like to call micro-narrations.
Oh.
Choose one tiny activity like making your bed or brushing your teeth and describe it out loud in English.
Oh, I love that idea. It feels so much more manageable
Yeah.
than trying to think in English for hours on end.
Exactly. And to make it stick connected to an existing habit. So maybe while you're waiting for your coffee to brew, you narrate what's happening. Or while you're walking the dog, you describe what you see. Little moments throughout the day can add up to big progress over time.
Okay, micro narrations are going on my list. It's like a mental workout for my English brain.
And like any, workout consistency is key. And the podcast also emphasized the importance of setting realistic goals and celebrating small wins along the way.
Yeah, that's so important because it's easy to get overwhelmed and discouraged if we set the bar too high.
Absolutely. Instead of aiming for fluency overnight, focus on making small, incremental improvements. So maybe this week you commit to 5 minutes of micro-narrations each day.
Yeah.
And when you hit that goal, celebrate.
Yeah.
It's all about building momentum and keeping yourself motivated.
I love that. It's like training for a marathon. You wouldn't expect to run 26 miles on your first day, right?
Right?
You start with shorter distances and gradually build up your endurance.
Precisely. And just like a marathon runner needs a support system, so do language learners. And the podcast emphasized the importance of surrounding yourself with people who encourage and believe in you.
Oh, that's such a good point. I think sometimes we underestimate the power of a positive and supportive community.
It can make a world of difference. Whether it's finding a language exchange partner, joining an online community, or simply connecting with friends or family members who speak English, having people to practice with and learn from can make the journey so much more enjoyable and rewarding.
Totally. Okay, so we've got realistic goals, a supportive community, and micro narrations to kind of kickstart that thinking in English habit.
Yeah.
What other gems did the podcast offer?
Well, they talked about the importance of finding a learning style that works for you.
Okay.
Not everyone learns best from textbooks and grammar drills.
Yeah.
Some people thrive on more immersive experiences like watching movies or listening to music.
I am definitely in that immersive camp. I find that I learn best by doing and experiencing.
Me too. And the podcast encouraged listeners to experiment and find what sparks their joy and keeps them engaged. It could be anything from reading English novels to watching YouTube videos to listening to podcasts.
Right. The key is to make it fun. Because if it's not enjoyable, we're less likely to stick with it.
Exactly. And speaking of fun, remember that technique we talked about earlier, the question and answer method?
Oh, yeah. The one where I basically have conversations with myself.
Yes.
It sounds a little crazy, but I can see how it could be really helpful for practicing spontaneous speaking.
It is. And it's something you can do anywhere, anytime. On the bus, in the shower, while you're waiting in line. Just come up with a question and answer it out loud as if you were talking to someone else.
I'm going to try that later today. It's like a secret weapon for building fluency.
And the podcast had another great tip for boosting fluency. Recording yourself speaking English. I know we talked about this earlier, but I think it's worth emphasizing again because it's such a powerful tool.
I have to admit, I'm still a bit hesitant to hit that record button. It feels a bit like listening to your own voicemail sometimes. It's better not to know.
I understand. It can be a little cringeworthy at first, but it's incredibly valuable for identifying areas where you can improve. And the podcast offered some great suggestions for making it less intimidating.
Okay, tell me more. How can I make recording myself less scary?
Start with short, focused recordings. Instead of trying to record a 10-minute presentation, focus on specific skills you want to practice. Maybe you record yourself describing your favorite hobby for 1 minute, or summarizing a news article, or even just reading a paragraph from a book.
That's a great idea. Breaking it down into smaller chunks makes it feel much more approachable.
Yeah.
And then I can listen back and kind of analyze my pronunciation, my grammar, my fluency, without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Exactly. And over time, as you listen to those recordings, you'll start to notice patterns and areas where you can improve. Maybe you realize that you tend to speak too quickly when you're nervous, or that you struggle with a particular sound, or that you have a habit of using filler words like and like too often.
Right. It's like becoming your own language coach.
Precisely. And once you've identified those areas, you can focus your practice on improving them.
Okay, I'm starting to see the value of cringe and learn. But all this talk about pronunciation makes me wonder, are there any specific pronunciation challenges that are common for speakers of my native language?
That's a great question, and one that we can definitely delve into. But I think we've covered a lot of ground already in this part of our deep dive. Maybe we can save that discussion for the next part after a quick recap of what we've learned so far.
That sounds good to me. This is a lot of information to digest, and I want to make sure I'm absorbing it all.
Absolutely. And remember, learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint. It's okay to take breaks, review what you've learned, and go at your own pace.
Okay, so before we move on, let's take a moment to recap some of the key takeaways from this part of our deep dive. What stood out to you the most? All right, so we've unpacked like a ton of techniques for how to be more confident, speaking English, shadowing thinking in English, reading aloud,
Yeah.
you name it. But now comes the fun part, actually putting it all into practice. Any advice on where to start?
Well, a good action plan should always be personalized. So what are some of the specific areas that you're most excited to work on?
You know, honestly, thinking in English feels like a real breakthrough concept for me, but I'm also a little intimidated by it. It feels like such a big shift. So where do I even begin?
It's all about starting small and building from there. So remember we talked about those micro narrations?
Yeah.
Instead of narrating your whole day, just pick one tiny activity and describe it out loud in English.
Right, like making coffee or getting dressed, just making those little moments a chance to practice.
Exactly. And to make it stick, try attaching it to a habit that you already have. So while you're brushing your teeth, you can narrate what you're doing, waiting for the bus. You can describe the people and the cars around you. It's about turning those mindless moments into English practice.
I love that. It feels so much more doable than like trying to suddenly have all my thoughts in English 24/7.
And speaking of making things enjoyable, We can actually combine techniques for even more impact.
Huh.
So given your love for immersive learning, how about pairing that with the question and answer method?
Ooh, that sounds interesting. What would that look like in practice?
Okay, so imagine you're watching your favorite English show.
Okay.
You pause it at a key scene, and you ask yourself questions about it. What are the characters feeling? What might happen next? And then you answer those questions out loud as though you were discussing it with a friend.
Wow, that's brilliant. It's like turning passive watching into an active speaking exercise.
Exactly. You're engaged with the content you already love, so it feels less like a chore.
Mm-hmm.
And because you're thinking critically about the story, those English responses are more likely to stick.
I am so trying that tonight with my next episode. Any other combo moves you think would work well for me?
Well, you mentioned wanting to refine your pronunciation. We can weave that in too. So how about recording yourself while shadowing?
Oh, that's a great idea. So I'd be mimicking my chosen English speaker and getting immediate feedback on how my own pronunciation sounds.
Precisely. You can even compare your recording to the original audio, really hearing those nuances. It's like having a personalized pronunciation coach right in your pocket.
All right, I'm officially geeking out over all these techniques. I feel like I have a real plan now, not just this vague idea of, oh, I want to speak English better.
That's the spirit. And remember, the podcast emphasizes that everyone learns differently.
Yeah.
What works for one person might not work for another. So be open to experimenting, to finding what clicks for you.
Totally. And speaking of specifics, what about those pronunciation things we were going to discuss? Anything I should be particularly aware of based on my native language?
Absolutely. Based on what you've shared, one area you might want to focus on is differentiating between the th sound, so the voiced s as in this, and the unvoiced f as in think.
Oh, yeah. Those can be tricky. I sometimes catch myself swapping them or just defaulting to a D or a T sound.
It's a common challenge,
Mm-hmm.
but there are exercises you can do to strengthen those muscles and get those sounds right. One tip is to practice placing your tongue between your teeth and gently blowing air out.
Okay, I can try that. Anything else to be mindful of?
Another area you might focus on is vowel sounds.
Okay.
English has a lot more vowel sounds than many other languages, and some of them can be quite subtle.
Yeah, that makes sense. I sometimes feel like my vowels all kind of blend together, and I'm not sure I'm always hitting the right sounds.
One fun way to practice vowel sounds is by singing along to English songs.
Oh, fun!
Pay close attention to how the singer articulates those vowels and try to mimic them.
I love that idea. It's like a sneaky way to practice pronunciation without feeling like I'm studying.
Exactly. And remember, those pronunciation apps we talked about can be really helpful for targeted practice too.
This has been so incredibly helpful. I feel like I've gone from feeling really overwhelmed and unsure to having a clear path forward.
That's wonderful to hear. And remember, we've only scratched the surface here. There are tons of resources and communities out there for English language learners.
Right, like those language exchange apps and the online communities we talked about.
Exactly. Don't hesitate to reach out and connect with others who are on the same journey. Sharing tips, practicing together, and supporting each other can make the process so much more enjoyable.
And as they said in the podcast, practice makes progress, not perfection. So cheers to embracing those mistakes, celebrating the small wins, and never giving up on the goal of speaking English confidently.
Cheers to that. You've got this. And remember, the most important thing is to simply keep speaking, keep practicing, and keep enjoying the process.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into speaking English confidently. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and actionable advice to take your English speaking skills to the next level. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, keep speaking.
Thanks for watching this video from Simply English, an educational channel for all ages and all stages. If you're new to this channel and enjoyed this video, please subscribe and press the like button. If you have any suggestions, please mention them in the comments section. Take care, and goodbye.